The mules screamed a heartbeat before Edith Crawford saw the wall of wild horses crash out of the lodgepole pines. And by the time Seth Wells hauled her off her feet and threw them both into the brush-choked ravine beside the trail, every rifle, every satchel of medicine, and every scrap of food they carried was already gone, scattered downriver in a thunder of hooves and dust. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked clean out of her, Seth's arm still locked across her back like a bar of iron. Above them the pack train tore apart, canvas ripped. A crate of glass vials shattered against a boulder, and she heard herself cry out at the sound of it. Months of careful preparation dashed to pieces in 3 seconds of chaos. The lead mule, Bonnet, went down screaming and up again, and then the whole string was gone, driven before a herd of perhaps 40 wild horses that had come down off the ridge like something out of a fever dream, spooked by she did not yet know what. When the dust settled, and the drumming hooves faded into the canyon below, Seth Wells did not let go of her right away. He lay half over her, shielding her with the breadth of his own body, and only when the last hoofbeat died did he lift his head and look down at her with an expression she remembered from 20 years past, though everything else about him had changed. "You hurt?" His voice was low, rough with dust. "No." She pushed herself up on her elbows and he rolled off her at once, careful, as if suddenly aware of how long he had been holding her. "No, I do not think so. Seth, the mule's gone." He stood, offering her his hand, and she took it without thinking, felt the calluses across his palm, the strength in the grip that lifted her to her feet as though she weighed nothing at all. "Gone with everything we packed on them. Rifles, food, your medicine chest." Edith looked down the trail where the herd had vanished, then back the way they had come, and her stomach dropped clean through the canyon floor. 6 days out from Salmon City. No weapons. No food beyond what might be in their pockets. And somewhere in that wreckage, scattered across 2 miles of wild Idaho mountainside, lay every vial and instrument she had carried west to save the lives of people she had never met. She pressed a hand to the small brass compass that hung on a leather cord beneath her collar, an old habit, a thing she did without thinking whenever the ground seemed to tilt beneath her, and found it there, warm from her skin, safe. Her grandfather's compass. It was, she realized with a strange, cold clarity, very nearly the only thing of value she had left. It had not always been so simple between them, this trust, this instant obedience of her body to his hand. 4 days earlier, Edith had walked into the mercantile at Salmon City with her medical bag over one shoulder and her grandfather's letter of introduction in her pocket, expecting to hire a stranger to guide her up the Salmon River Trail to a mining settlement called Paradise Bar, and had instead found herself staring across the counter at a face she had not seen since she was 17 years old. He had grown a foot, it seemed, though that was surely impossible. He had been a lanky, quiet boy of 19, the last time she had seen him, all elbows and silence, standing at his father's grave with his jaw clenched so hard she had feared his teeth might crack. Now he filled the doorway of Bratton's mercantile like a piece of the mountain itself had walked in wearing buckskin, his shoulders wide enough that he had to turn sideways to pass through the frame, his forearms corded with the kind of muscle that came from decades of hauling traps and firewood and canoes, rather than from any gymnasium, his dark hair grown past his collar and pushed back from a face weathered brown by sun and wind. Only his eyes were the same, that same startling gray-green, and when they found her across the counter, something in them went very still. "Edith Crawford," he had said, and it was not a question. "Seth Wells." She had set down her bag slowly, as if any sudden movement might make the moment collapse. "I heard you had gone into the mountains after your father died. I did not know it had made you into a giant." That had almost gotten a smile out of him. Almost. They had not spoken of the years between then, not that first evening, though the mercantile owner, a garrulous man named Bratton, had been happy enough to fill in what gaps existed. How Seth Wells had walked into the wilderness after the cave-in that killed his father at the old Custer diggings. How he had built himself a chain of cabins along the river and the high country beyond it. How half the trappers and prospectors and lonesome homesteaders scattered across 200 miles of Idaho backcountry owed him their lives one winter or another, for he was the only man fool enough or skilled enough to travel those mountains when the snow came, carrying salt and quinine and news, sometimes simply company to men who would otherwise have died alone. Seth Wells did not live near people. He lived among them unseen, like a root system beneath a forest, and when Edith Crawford had arrived asking for a guide to Paradise Bar, the only man anyone trusted to take her there was him. She had told him, over coffee that first night, why she had come. Her grandfather, Dr. Abraham Crawford, had spent 40 years riding a circuit of frontier towns from the Bitterroot to the Bruno, and 6 months past he had died in his sleep in Boise City with his boots by the door and his bag packed for a trip he never took, because a letter had come from Paradise Bar asking for a doctor, and there had been no one to answer it. Edith had answered it instead. She had trained under her grandfather since she was 14, had sat her examinations in Denver 2 years past, had practiced 18 months in a mining town in Colorado before word reached her that Paradise Bar, a copper camp on a fork of the Salmon River, had gone 2 years without so much as a visiting physician, and had men and women dying of things that need not kill them. She had taken up her grandfather's bag and his compass and had come. Seth had listened to all of it without a word, and when she finished, he had reached across the table and turned the little brass compass over once in his fingers, reading the initials scratched into its case, AC, before letting it fall back against her collarbone. "He taught you to read that country," he had said. "Not a question either. He taught me everything." "Then we will get you there," Seth had said, and that had been the whole of his promise, plain and complete, the way she remembered him being plain and complete about everything even as a boy. Now, standing in the ravine with the dust of the stampede still hanging gold in the afternoon light, that promise had become considerably harder to keep. "Someone drove that herd," Seth said, crouching to study the tracks beyond the ravine's lip, and there was an edge in his voice she had not heard before. "Wild horses do not run in that tight a line without something pushing from behind. Look here." He pointed to a set of shod hoofprints cutting in from the east, overlaying the wild herd's unshod tracks in 3 places. 3 riders. They came down off that ridge and drove that herd square into our camp. Edith felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Who would do such a thing? "That," Seth said, rising, "is a question I would very much like to ask them, but not today. Today we have got no rifle, no food but what is in my pockets, and 11 miles of hard country between us and the nearest roof." He looked at her, and whatever had been sharp and dangerous in his face a moment before gentled when it landed on her. "Can you walk 11 miles, Edith Crawford?" She lifted her chin. "I walked 6 miles a day for 2 weeks running a house call circuit in the San Juans with a broken toe, Seth Wells. I imagine I can manage 11 with all my toes intact." That finally got the smile out of him, quick and startled, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but she had seen it, and something in her chest turned over at the sight of it, warm and unfamiliar and entirely unwelcome given the circumstances. They set off downriver, following the wreck of their own packed train as much as they could, salvaging what had survived. Most of it was ruined. A crate of quinine sulfate had split open across a rock and dissolved into the dirt. Bandage rolls floated in the shallows. But Edith found, wedged beneath a fallen pack frame, her grandfather's leather medical satchel, water-stained but whole, and inside it, miraculously, a case of surgical instruments, a roll of catgut suture, and perhaps 24 vials that had survived the fall by virtue of having been wrapped in wool stockings for the journey. "It is not everything," she said, cradling the satchel against her chest as though it were a child, "but it is enough to work with, enough to begin." Seth had found, for his part, one skinning knife that had been in his own coat pocket rather than on the pack mule, a coil of rope, and a tin of matches that had somehow stayed dry. It was not much of an arsenal for 11 miles of grisly country, and whoever had driven that herd through their camp, but Seth Wells did not seem overly troubled by the lack. "I have walked these mountains with less," he said, and something in the flat certainty of it made her believe him entirely. The compass came out within the hour, when the trail forked at a scree slope, and the blazed trees Seth had been following thinned into nothing. Edith drew it from beneath her collar, opened the case with the small, worn click that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, and watched the needle settle. "West-northwest," she said. "My grandfather always said the river bends west before it bends south again below Paradise Bar. If we hold this bearing, we should strike it inside 2 miles. Seth studied her for a moment, an odd, considering look, and then glanced at the compass itself. "May I?" She passed it to him, and he turned it over in his broad hand with a gentleness that surprised her, given the strength so plainly coiled in every line of him, tracing the scratched initials with his thumb the way he had at the mercantile table days before. "My father had one like this," he said quietly. "Not so fine. Tin case, cracked glass. He used to say a compass only tells you where north is. It cannot tell you where you ought to go. A man has to know that for himself." He handed it back to her. "Your grandfather teach you that too. He taught me that the two things are not so different as people believe," Edith said, closing her hand around the brass case. "Knowing where you are and knowing where you are going. You cannot truly manage one without the other." Seth looked at her a moment longer than the conversation strictly required and then nodded toward the scree slope. "West-northwest, then." "Doctor's orders." They reached the river by dusk, and Seth's nearest line cabin, a low structure of peeled logs tucked into a stand of cedar above a bend where the salmon ran green and fast over granite. An hour after that, walking the last mile in the deepening blue dark with nothing but starlight and the sound of the water to guide them. Edith's feet had gone past aching into a kind of distant numbness, and when Seth finally pushed open the cabin door and struck a match to the lamp within, she nearly wept at the sight of 4 walls and a stove. "It is not much," Seth said, setting the lamp on the table and moving to lay a fire in the small iron stove with the quick, economical motions of a man who had done the same task 1,000 times in 1,000 kinds of weather. "But it is dry, and I keep it stocked. There is dried venison in that tin and coffee, and a bag of beans that will want soaking overnight." "It is a palace," Edith said, and meant it, easing herself onto the single narrow bunk built into the wall and finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day's fear now that it had somewhere safe to land. Seth, who would drive a herd of horses through a camp on purpose, what could they possibly want? He was quiet a moment, feeding kindling into the growing flame. "There is a man named Cornelius Vance who owns the copper works at Paradise Bar," he said finally. "I have had no love for him these 3 years, since he tried to buy my trap lines along Panther Creek and did not take kindly to being told no. If word got to him that a doctor was riding in to look close at his operation, a man like that might decide it was worth the trouble to see her delayed, or turned back entirely. Delayed how? A stampede is not a subtle thing to arrange." "No," Seth agreed, and there was something grim in the set of his jaw as he closed the stove door. "It is not." "Which tells me he wanted us to know it was done a purpose. A warning, not an accident." He looked at her across the small room, firelight catching the strong planes of his face, and for a moment the boy she had known at 17 and the man he had become seemed to stand in the same skin at once. "I do not like it, Edith. I do not like it at all. But I told you in Salmon City I would get you to Paradise Bar, and I will not go back on that for Cornelius Vance or any man like him." "I would not ask you to," she said, and found that she meant that too entirely. They reached Paradise Bar 3 days later, having walked out to a homestead along the river where Seth was owed a favor, and traded a morning's fence mending for the loan of 2 horses. And Edith's first sight of the settlement was not encouraging. It sat in a narrow fold of the mountains where a side creek met the main river, perhaps 40 rough buildings strung along a single muddy street, dominated at its upper end by the black timber headframe of the Vance Copper Works and the long tin-roofed stamping mill beside it, from whose stacks a thin gray haze drifted constantly downslope over the town itself. The people she saw on the street looked wrong to her physician's eye before she had even dismounted. A man loading ore carts moved with the stooped, shuffling gait of someone twice his apparent age. A woman hanging wash outside a leaning cabin coughed twice, hard, into a rag already spotted brown, before catching sight of the strangers and hurrying inside. Children playing in the dust had the too thin faces and swollen bellies of poor nutrition, but beneath that something else, a grayish cast to the skin around their mouths that made the hair rise on the back of Edith's neck. "Dear God," she said softly, reining in beside Seth at the edge of town. "Seth, look at them." "I have looked," he said low. "Every time I have come through here these 2 years, it is worse. Vance tells anyone who asks that it is bad water, something in the creek. Half the town believes him because he owns the only company store and the only paper deed to every cabin they live in, and a man does not care to argue with the fellow who can put him out on the road with a debt he cannot pay." They had not gone 20 more yards down the street before a man came out from beneath the porch of the largest building, a 2-story frame structure with VANCE copper WORKS painted across its false front, and Edith understood at once, without needing to be told, that this was Cornelius Vance himself. He was a compact, well-fed man of perhaps 50, dressed in a black coat too fine for the mud of the street, with pale, assessing eyes and the kind of smile that never once reached them. "Well," he said, coming down the steps with his hand already extended, "I had heard a doctor was expected." I confess I had not looked for her to arrive on a borrowed cart horse with mud to her knees and Seth Wells for an escort. Trouble on the trail was there. "A stampede," Edith said, keeping her voice level and her hand where it was, "which cost me my medicine chest, my rifle, and very nearly my life, Mr. Vance. I am told it did not look like an accident." Something flickered behind the pale eyes, gone as quickly as it came. "Wild country," he said smoothly. "Wild horses. A terrible shame." "You must let me make it right, Dr. Crawford. My company store can supply whatever you require at a fair price, and I have a cabin standing empty near the mill that would serve well enough as a surgery. Paradise Bar has wanted a doctor a long while. I would be glad to see you settled." "I am certain you would," Seth said, and there was nothing friendly at all in his voice now. Provided the doctor asked no questions Mr. Vance did not care to answer. Vance's smile did not so much as waver, but his eyes went hard as flint chips. "Wells, I had heard you were still crawling around these mountains living off rabbit skins. I would have thought you had better things to do than escort lady doctors on a fool's errand." "I would have thought a mine owner had better things to do," Seth said, "than arrange stampedes for travelers on a public trail, but here we both are." For a moment the two men simply looked at one another, and Edith felt the tension of it settle over the muddy street like a held breath. Then Vance laughed, short and without humor, and spread his hands. "Wild accusations from a wild man. Dr. Crawford, I will have that cabin readied within the hour. I trust you will find Paradise Bar grateful for your care, whatever nonsense Mr. Wells wishes to plant in your ear." He tipped his hat and walked away up the muddy street without waiting for an answer, and Edith watched him go with the distinct, uneasy sense of having just been measured for something. The cabin Vance provided was small but serviceable, and within 2 days Edith had a line of patients stretching out the door each morning that told her more plainly than any confession from Cornelius Vance exactly what kind of sickness had settled over Paradise Bar. She saw the cough first, in nearly every man who worked the stamping mill where the raw copper ore was crushed and separated. A deep, wet, rattling cough that brought up phlegm streaked gray and sometimes flecked with blood. She saw the gum disease next, blue-black lines along the teeth of men and women both, tremors in the hands of the ore sorters, a strange metallic taste that half her patients complained of and could not explain. She saw, worst of all, 3 children under the age of 10 with swollen joints and colic pains that no amount of chamomile or peppermint water eased for more than an hour. It took her 4 days of careful questioning, and one long night bent over her grandfather's old medical texts by lamplight, to be certain of what she was looking at, though a cold certainty had been growing in her from the first afternoon. This was not bad water. This was arsenic and lead, drawn up with the copper ore and released into the air of the stamping mill with every crushing stroke, settling over the town in that thin gray haze she had noticed on her first ride in, seeping into the wells that had been dug too near the mill's tailings pile. Chronic poisoning, slow and insidious killing paradise bar one cough and one colicky child at a time, and Cornelius Vance had known of it, must have known of it, for there was a proper way to ventilate a stamping mill and a system for settling tailings well clear of drinking water, and he had built neither, because both cost money he preferred to keep. "He knows," she told Seth that evening, pacing the small floor of her cabin while he sat at the table cleaning the borrowed rifle he had traded 2 beaver pelts to acquire from a homesteader down the valley. "Seth, I would stake my grandfather's memory on it. He knows precisely what that mill is doing to these people, and he has done nothing because doing something would cost him money, and instead he tells them it is bad water, and keeps every one of them in debt to his store so deep they cannot afford to leave even if they understood the danger." "I do not doubt it," Seth said, setting the rifle's cleaning rod aside. "I have seen the ledger books in that store, Edith, more than once, delivering hides for trade. A man works a season in that mill, and by the time his wages are set against his debt for flour and boots and rent on a company cabin, he owes Vance more than he started the season owing. There is no leaving a debt like that, not on foot, not with a family. Then I have to write to the territorial mining inspector." She stopped pacing, turned to face him fully. "I have to send proof. Water samples, my case notes, sworn statements if I can get any man brave enough to give one. There is an inspector's office in Boise City that can order the mill closed until proper ventilation is installed, can force Vance to settle his tailings clear of the wells. But I will need to reach a telegraph office to set the wheels moving quickly before more children sicken, and the nearest telegraph is Salmon City, 4 days' ride from here." Seth was quiet a long moment, turning the rifle over in his big hands, and when he looked up at her his eyes were very steady. "Then we will go to Salmon City. But Edith, you drove a stake into that man's business today just by diagnosing his mill correctly out loud to half the town. He is not going to let a wagon carrying proof of it roll out of Paradise Bar without a fight. You understand that?" "I understand it," she said, and found, to her own faint surprise, that the understanding did not frighten her nearly so much as the thought of doing nothing while children's joints swelled and men coughed blood into rags. "I did not come out here to be careful, Seth. I came to be useful." He looked at her for a long moment, something warm and rueful moving behind his eyes. "Your grandfather would have said the very same thing." "He did say the very same thing," Edith said, "more than once, usually to my grandmother, who despaired of him entirely." She managed a smile, tired as she was, and Seth's answering smile, quick and real, undid something in her chest that she had been trying very hard not to notice these past 6 days. It was 3 nights later, while Edith was setting a compound fracture for a young ore cart driver named Tom Higgins, who had gone down badly beneath an overturned cart at the mill, that the danger Seth had promised finally arrived in earnest. She had Tom's leg splinted and was preparing the traction when the door of her surgery cabin burst inward, and 2 men she did not recognize, big, rough-handed men with the look of hired muscle rather than miners, came through it with clubs in their fists and no words of explanation at all. What happened next occurred fast enough that Edith would only later be able to reconstruct it in pieces. She remembered shouting for Tom Higgins to stay down. She remembered one man swinging a club toward the shelf where her precious remaining vials of medicine stood, and lunging herself to shield them with her own body, without any clear thought beyond the vials must not break, and taking a glancing blow across her upper arm for her trouble that sent white fire shooting to her fingertips. And she remembered Seth Wells coming through the door behind them like something unleashed, all that mountain-built strength suddenly given somewhere to go, hauling the first man off his feet by the collar and throwing him bodily into the wood stove hard enough to buckle its iron door, and turning on the second before the man had fully registered what was happening, taking a wild swing of the club across his own shoulder to spare Edith a second blow, and answering it with a single driving fist to the jaw that put the man flat on the floorboards and kept him there. It was over in perhaps 20 seconds. Edith stood pressed against the shelf, cradling her throbbing arm, staring at Seth Wells breathing hard in the wreckage of her cabin, blood from a split knuckle running unheeded down his hand, and felt something in her chest crack open entirely. "Are they Vance's men?" she managed. "They are somebody's men," Seth said, striding to her side, all the violence gone out of him in an instant, replaced by a gentleness that made her throat tight. "Let me see your arm." "It is nothing, truly, Edith." Just her name, quiet, and something in the way he said it stopped her protest cold. He took her arm with hands that could have broken a man's jaw a moment before, and now moved over her bruised flesh with exquisite care, rolling back her sleeve, pressing along the bone with 2 fingers to check for fracture with a competence that surprised her, until she remembered how many winters he must have spent setting his own injuries alone in cabins like this one, miles from any doctor. "Not broken. You will have a bruise the size of my hand by morning, but it is not broken." He looked up at her, and the relief in his face was so plain, so entirely unguarded, that she felt her breath catch. "I thought he had broken it. I thought he stopped himself." "You thought what?" she asked softly. "I thought I had let something happen to you," he said low, "and I did not care for the feeling of it, not one bit." They stood very close together in the lamplit wreckage of the surgery, his hand still cradling her forearm with a tenderness entirely at odds with the split knuckles and the 2 unconscious men on her floor, and for a moment neither of them moved at all. Then Tom Higgins, still lying splinted on the table, cleared his throat with the pointed delicacy of a young man who did not wish to be forgotten, and the moment broke, though not entirely, for Seth's hand lingered a half-second longer against her arm before he let it fall, and something new and warm had settled between them that neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. Word of the attack went through Paradise Bar by morning, and if Cornelius Vance had hoped to frighten the town's new doctor into silence, he had badly misjudged both her and the temper of a settlement that had endured 2 years of sickness with no one to name it. By noon, 4 men from the mill had come to her cabin door of their own accord to give sworn statements about wages withheld against impossible debts, about the mill foreman ordering the ventilation shafts sealed to save on lumber, about a previous doctor, a Dr. Ambrose, who had come through Paradise Bar 18 months prior, begun asking the very questions Edith was asking, and left within a week after a quiet word from Mr. Vance about the poor condition of the trail south, never to be heard from again. That last piece of testimony, delivered by a gray-haired blacksmith named Munro who had known Dr. Ambrose slightly, chilled Edith more than anything else she had learned in Paradise Bar. "You are telling me Vance ran a doctor off this mountain to keep him quiet," she said, "and no one thought to write to the territorial board." "Write with what, ma'am?" Munro said, not unkindly. "There is no telegraph nearer than Salmon City, and Vance's own freight wagons are the only ones that run that road regular. A letter goes out through his hands, or it does not go out at all, not reliably. We are not fools up here, doctor. We are trapped, same as the debt traps a man in his ledger books." It was Seth, listening from the doorway with his arms folded and his jaw tight, who spoke into the silence that followed. "Then we will not send a letter," he said. "We will carry the proof out ourselves and put it into the inspector's hands direct, in Boise City if need be, but Salmon City first for the telegraph. Vance cannot stop what he does not know is moving." "He will know within the hour that we have left," Edith said. "This is not a town where secrets travel slowly, Seth. whatever else it lacks. Then we will need to be faster than his men, Seth said, and luckier besides. But it is the only road there is, Edith. Waiting will not make it shorter, and every day we wait is another day that Mill keeps grinding poison into the air over these children. They left Paradise Bar 2 mornings later before first light, in a light spring wagon Seth had borrowed from the blacksmith Monroe, loaded with Edith's case notes. 4 sealed jars of well water from 3 different points around the settlement, a folder of sworn statements, and a canvas sack of ore tailings scraped from beside the mill's discharge chute that Edith intended as physical evidence of the arsenic content. She was certain the samples would show. Seth drove, the borrowed rifle across his knees, and Edith sat beside him with her grandfather's compass in her lap more from habit than necessity, since the road south to Salmon City was a known one, a narrow shelf road cut into the canyon wall above the Salmon River that Seth had traveled more times than he could readily count. They were perhaps 9 miles out of Paradise Bar, with the canyon walls rising steep and rust-colored to either side and the river running 200 feet below in a churn of white water, when Seth glanced back over his shoulder and his whole body went taut. "Riders," he said. 3 of them, coming fast. Edith turned in her seat and saw them, 3 horsemen already close enough to make out at a gallop along the shelf road behind them, throwing up plumes of red dust in the still morning air. She did not need to ask whose men they were. "Can we outrun them?" she asked, already bracing one hand against the wagon's side rail. "Not on a straightaway, not with this weight in the bed," Seth said, already flicking the reins hard across the horses' backs, urging them from a trot into a hard canter that made the wagon buck and shudder over the rutted shelf road. "But there is a place ahead where the road narrows to single width above a rock slide. If we can reach it first, they cannot pass us 3 abreast, and I know this canyon better than any man Vance could hire." The wagon lurched forward, the horses straining into their collars, and Edith gripped the rail with one hand and the canvas sack of evidence with the other, watching the canyon wall blur past on her right while on her left the drop to the river yawned wider with every 100 yards, a sheer fall of raw stone with nothing at the bottom but white water and boulders the size of houses. The narrow shelf road had been cut for packed trains and light wagons, not for a desperate race, and every jolt of the wheels over exposed rock sent her heart into her throat. Behind them, one of the riders had drawn a pistol and fired, the shot cracking flat and sharp off the canyon walls, wide of its mark but close enough that Edith flinched hard into Seth's shoulder. "Get down," Seth barked. "Down in the bed behind the evidence crate now, Edith. If I get down I cannot watch the road for you, I can see the road. Get down." There was no time to argue the principle of the thing. She scrambled back into the wagon bed, pressing herself low against the boards behind the canvas-wrapped crate of samples, and from that position she could see Seth's back above her, broad and unmoving despite the shots now coming with more regularity, his hands steady on the reins as he guided the racing horses along a shelf of road scarcely wider than the wagon's own axle, with a rock wall inches from the right wheel and a 200-foot drop inches from the left. The road curved hard around a shoulder of red stone, and for one endless heartbeat, the outside wheels seemed to hang over empty air before the wagon's weight swung back true, and Edith bit down a scream, and instead reached up to press her hand flat against the small of Seth's back, needing to touch something solid in the midst of the terror, and felt beneath her palm the iron-hard tension of muscle working to hold a straining team on a knife's edge of stone and nothing. "There," Seth called, over the thunder of hooves and wheels and the shouts now growing closer behind them. "The narrows just ahead. Hold on to something, Edith. This next stretch is going to shake you loose from your teeth." The road did narrow, exactly as he had promised, pinching down to a shelf barely the width of the wagon itself, where a rockslide decades old had eaten half the trail away, leaving a raw scar of tumbled stone on the outside edge that fell sheer to the river below. Seth did not slow the team. If anything, he urged them faster, and Edith understood in a flash of pure terrified clarity that slowing here, on this narrow a shelf, with pursuit closing from behind, would be its own kind of death, that the only safety lay in speed and absolute trust in the man holding the reins. She trusted him. She realized it in that same flashing instant, trusted him with a completeness that startled her even as the wagon screamed through the narrows with its outside wheels skating along the very lip of the drop, trusted the boy she had known and the man he had become in equal measure, and did not close her eyes, because some stubborn part of her wanted to watch him do this impossible, magnificent thing. They came through the narrows in perhaps 4 seconds that felt like a lifetime, and the road widened again beyond it into a broader shelf backed by a stand of pine, and Seth hauled the team into the tree line and around, so that when the 3 pursuing riders came through the narrows themselves, strung out single file and forced to slow for the passage, they emerged to find the wagon stopped broadside across the road ahead of them with Seth Wells standing in the bed, rifle leveled, and Edith Crawford beside him, holding Vance's own hired thug's abandoned pistol, retrieved from beneath the wagon seat where it had fallen loose in the crossing, steady in both hands. "That is far enough," Seth said, and his voice carried the particular flat calm of a man who has run out of patience entirely. "You can turn around and ride back to Vance and tell him the doctor's evidence is going to Boise City whether he likes it or not, or you can come through this narrows one at a time into a leveled rifle. Your choice, gentlemen, but make it quick, because my arms do not tire and I have got all day." The 3 riders, drawing rein in a confused knot at the mouth of the narrows, looked at the leveled rifle and the pistol beside it, and at the sheer drop still yawning at their backs, and made the sensible choice. They wheeled their horses and rode back the way they had come, and Seth did not lower the rifle until the last of them had vanished around the red stone shoulder of the canyon wall. Only then did he let out a long breath and turn to Edith, and see, for the first time since the chase began, that her hands, so steady a moment before, had begun to shake now that the danger had passed. "Edith." He set the rifle down and crossed the wagon bed to her in 2 strides, taking her cold hands in his own warm, broad ones, easing the pistol from her grip with such gentleness she nearly wept from the contrast of it against the violence of the last quarter hour. "You are safe. It is done. You are safe." "I know," she said, and heard her own voice shake. "I know I have delivered babies in the middle of blizzards, Seth Wells. I have set bones by lamplight in mining camps with men screaming loud enough to wake the dead. And I have never in my life been so frightened as I was on that road just now, watching you drive that team along a shelf of stone with nothing beneath the wheels but air." "I was frightened too," he admitted, low, still holding her hands. "I have driven that narrows a dozen times, alone, with nothing to lose but myself if I misjudged it. I have never driven it with you in the bed behind me, and I do not care to do it again if it can be helped. I do not know when you became a thing I was afraid to lose, Edith Crawford, but somewhere on this fool's errand of yours, you did." The words hung between them in the pine-scented morning air, and Edith looked up into his face, weathered and strong and open now in a way she suspected very few people ever saw it, and found she had no wish at all to pretend she did not understand him perfectly. "I have been afraid of the very same thing," she said softly, "since the night you set my medicine chest between us like a shield and told me you would not let harm come to it or to me, and meant it with your whole chest. I did not come to Idaho looking for this, Seth. I came looking for sick children and a mine owner's secrets. I did not expect to find you again, grown into the very best of the man I always suspected you would become." He lifted one hand from hers, slow, giving her every chance to step back if she wished it, and cupped her cheek with a palm rough enough to have skinned 100 beaver and gentle enough to make her breath catch entirely. "I loved you when we were children and did not have sense enough to know what to call it," he said. "I have got sense enough now." "Then perhaps you had better use it," Edith said, and closed the last small distance between them herself, rising on her toes to press her mouth to his. The kiss was not long. There on the narrow shelf road with the river roaring far below and evidence of a poisoned town packed in a crate at their feet. But it was entirely thorough, and when they finally drew apart, Seth was smiling in a way she had not yet seen from him, unguarded and young and full of something like wonder. "We had better get you to that telegraph office," he said, though he did not immediately let go of her hand. "Before I forget entirely why we came out on this road in the first place." They reached Salmon City late that same afternoon, and within an hour Edith had dictated a telegram to the territorial mining inspector's office in Boise City so thorough and so damning that the operator's eyebrows had risen steadily higher with every line, detailing arsenic and lead contamination confirmed by physical samples, documented cases of chronic poisoning including in children under 10, sworn statements regarding falsified safety conditions, and an established pattern of debt bondage, and the disappearance under threat of a previous physician 18 months prior. She sent a second telegram to the medical board that had certified her, requesting that an official investigator be dispatched alongside the mining inspector, and a third, on Seth's quiet suggestion, to the federal marshal's office covering the territory, on the theory that a man who arranged stampedes and sent hired thugs to beat a doctor in her own surgery had likely broken laws that fell rather more squarely within a marshal's purview than a mining inspector's. The response, when it came 2 days later while they waited in Salmon City, was swift and satisfying in a way frontier justice so rarely managed to be. The territorial mining inspector, a dry, precise man named Fowler who had clearly seen enough copper camps to have no illusions left about the breed of man who ran the worst of them, arrived with a deputy marshal in tow and a set of orders that would have made Cornelius Vance's pale eyes go very cold indeed had he been present to read them. But Edith and Seth rode back into Paradise Bar 3 days after that with Fowler and the marshal's party, and got there in time to watch it happen themselves. Cornelius Vance did not go quietly. He stood on the porch of his fine, false-fronted office and shouted about property rights and unlawful interference, and the ingratitude of a town he had built with his own capital, until the deputy marshal produced a warrant sworn on the strength of Edith's evidence and 4 separate statements of assault and intimidation, at which point Vance's shouting turned rather quickly to a demand for a lawyer, and then, when it became clear that Salmon City's lawyer was riding with the marshal's party specifically to serve him, to a sullen and complete silence. He was taken out of Paradise Bar in irons 2 days later, bound for trial in Boise City on charges that Fowler assured Edith would very likely see him imprisoned for a decade or more, given the weight of physical evidence and the number of witnesses now entirely willing, with Vance's power broken, to speak plainly about what they had endured. The mine itself did not close, to the town's considerable relief, for a copper camp with no copper works was a copper camp with no reason to exist at all. Instead, under a court-appointed receiver pending sale to a new operator, the stamping mill was shut down for 6 weeks while proper ventilation shafts were cut, and the tailings pile relocated well clear of the town's wells, work that Fowler himself oversaw with a precision that suggested he took a personal satisfaction in undoing the damage he had spent his career watching men like Vance inflict. Every miner's debt recorded in Vance's ledger books was declared void by the receiver's order, the books themselves having been found, upon examination, to be so thoroughly falsified as to be worthless as legal instruments in any case. Tom Higgins, his leg healing straight and true under Edith's continued care, was among the first to walk out of the company store owing nothing at all for the first time in 3 years, and he wept openly on the porch when he understood it, which set off a fair portion of the town doing the same. Edith stayed on through that 6 weeks of repair, treating the lingering effects of poisoning in dozens of patients, watching the worst of the coughs begin, slowly, to ease as the mill's dust stopped drifting over the town, watching the gray cast fade from children's faces as clean well water and better food, purchased now with wages the miners actually kept, began to do their own quiet healing. Seth stayed too, splitting his time between his trap lines, which could not be neglected entirely even for love, and Paradise Bar, where he had taken up, without any particular fanfare, the habit of appearing at Edith's cabin door each evening with fresh meat, or a fixed hinge, or simply himself, and staying long into the evening talking with her by lamplight about everything and nothing, about her grandfather's old campaigns treating cholera in Kansas railroad camps, about Seth's own solitary winters and the particular satisfaction of a well-set trap line, about the childhood they had shared in Salmon City that neither of them, it turned out, had ever quite stopped thinking about. It was on one such evening, 6 weeks into the mill's repairs, with the last of the summer's rare, peaceful weather still holding warm and golden over the valley, that Seth Wells set down the tin cup of coffee he had been nursing, reached into his coat, and drew out a small object wrapped in a scrap of soft doeskin. "I have been carrying this around 3 weeks trying to work out how to say what I mean to say," he admitted, and for the first time since she had known him as a grown man, Edith saw Seth Wells look genuinely uncertain of himself. "I am better with a trap line than with words, Edith. You know that of me. So I will just say it plain, the way you taught me a man ought to say a true thing. I do not want to spend my winters alone in that cabin above the river anymore, not now that I know what it is to have you in it instead. I do not want to be the man other people rely on from a careful distance, admired and left be. I want to be relied on by you, close up, every single day, for the rest of however many years the mountains see fit to give us." He unwrapped the doeskin, and inside it lay a ring, simple and plain, hammered from a coin by, she would learn later, the very blacksmith, Munro, who had lent them the wagon for the mountain chase, its band worn smooth already from Seth's own nervous handling of it these 3 weeks. "Marry me," he said, simple and complete, the way he was about everything that mattered. "Not because I saved your medicine chest from a club, and not because you talked 3 armed men off a mountain road with nothing but a borrowed pistol, and more nerve than I have seen in most men twice your size. Marry me because you came into that mercantile in Salmon City and looked at me like I was still the boy you remembered instead of the wild thing everyone else in this territory thinks I have become, and because ever since, I have not been able to imagine going back to being only that wild thing again. You gave this whole valley back their health, Edith Crawford. I am only asking you to consider giving one lonesome trapper a home." Edith found that her eyes had filled entirely without her permission, and she did not bother trying to hide it. "Seth Wells," she said, "I have set more bones and delivered more babies and stitched more wounds in my life than I can readily count, and not one of them ever made my hands shake the way yours are shaking right now, holding out that ring. I loved you when we were children before I understood what love was worth calling. I love you now entirely, understanding it very well indeed. Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her then properly, in the golden evening light spilling through the cabin's single window, and if it lacked the desperate urgency of the kiss on the canyon shelf, it more than made up for it in the sweetness of a promise finally spoken plainly between 2 people who had wasted altogether too many years not saying it. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright, mild afternoon in the last gasp of that unusually peaceful autumn, in the very street of Paradise Bar, where Edith had first faced down Cornelius Vance with mud to her knees, though the street itself bore little resemblance now to the sickly, gray-hazed place she had ridden into that spring. The mill's new ventilation stack stood clean and tall against the mountainside, drawing off no more than honest steam. The children who had once had swollen joints and gray-tinged mouths ran shrieking and laughing between the gathered wedding guests, plump and browned by a summer of clean water and full bellies. Tom Higgins, walking now without the least trace of a limp, stood as one of Seth's witnesses, having appointed himself, somewhat to Seth's bemused embarrassment, as an unofficial best man on the strength of the debt he felt he owed them both. Monroe the blacksmith had fashioned, in addition to Edith's ring, a small silver locket as a wedding gift, into which the town's new schoolteacher, a delicate-fingered young woman who had arrived with the fall supply wagon, had painted a tiny, careful image of a compass rose in honor, Monroe explained gruffly, of the instrument that had gotten the doctor to them, and in his own considered opinion, gotten her rather thoroughly turned around into loving a mountain man besides. Edith wore her grandfather's compass on its leather cord beneath her wedding dress that day, close against her heart, where it had ridden through every mile of the journey that had brought her to this street, this crowd of healthy, laughing faces, this man standing before her in a borrowed but carefully brushed coat with his dark hair tied back, and his gray-green eyes bright with a happiness she suspected he had never once in his adult life expected to feel. The circuit preacher who had ridden up from Salmon City for the occasion, a stooped, kindly man named Reverend Alcott who had known Edith's grandfather slightly in years past, spoke simply and well of two people who had come together not out of desperation or convenience, but out of a courage each had recognized in the other, a courage neither one of them alone had ever needed to prove but which together had proven enough to change the fate of an entire town. When he asked Seth Wells whether he would take Edith Crawford as his wife, to protect and to be protected by in equal measure, for that was how the Reverend, at Seth's own particular request, had chosen to word the vow, Seth answered with a firmness that carried clean across the gathered crowd, and when he asked the same of Edith, her own answer carried just as clear and just as sure. They kissed as husband and wife to the sound of the whole of Paradise Bar cheering, Monroe's hammer-thin voice loudest among them, and Tom Higgins threw his hat so high it landed on the mill's own weather vane, where it would remain, by all later accounts, for the better part of a year, a small flag of celebration flying over a town that had, in one remarkable season, been saved twice over, once from a slow poison it had not understood, and once in its own smaller way. From the loneliness of a doctor who had come seeking direction, and a mountain man who had spent a decade learning to live entirely without hope of finding any himself, Edith Crawford became, in the months that followed, the settled physician Paradise Bar had waited 2 years and lost one doctor to secure. Her cabin surgery expanded with lumber the grateful town itself donated and raised in a single generous weekend. Her grandfather's medical texts finally shelved properly rather than carried in a battered satchel from camp to camp. Seth Wells did not give up his trap lines entirely, for the scattered cabins and homesteads along that stretch of the wild Salmon River still needed the particular knowledge only he possessed. But he built, before the first snow of that winter fell, a proper house on a rise above the town where the river bent west before turning south again, close enough that Edith could walk to her surgery each morning, and close enough that Seth could be home for supper most nights of the year. And if some winters still called him out onto the high trails to check a line or carry salt to a snowbound homestead, he went now with the sure and steady knowledge that a light would be burning for him in a window at the end of it, and a woman waiting who understood, better than anyone else alive, exactly what it meant to find your way home.